Hi, and welcome to Scale Model Basics. I'm Aaron Skinner, and we're going to be talking about some tips and tricks for dealing with resin. Now, resin parts can come in kits as detail sets or as aftermarket detail sets, and in some cases you can get whole model kits that are made out of resin. So one of the things about dealing with resin is that just like plastic parts come on a parts tree where they're molded into that frame, resin parts include a pour stub. This is an artifact of the casting process. As you can see on this nicely molded or cast 48 scale Spitfire seat from Edward, you can see it's beautifully cast, very thin, which is one of the things about resin. Resin can create very thin parts, which are almost impossible to recreate in injection molded plastic. So that's one of the advantages and why it's included in a lot of kits. But it includes this big chunk of excess resin at the bottom. So how do we remove that? Number one, don't use snips. You might be tempted to because you're thinking, well, that'll make quick work of it. But the snips put a lot of pressure on the resin, and resin is delicate and fragile. And that excess pressure can often snap a thin part like this seat and leave the part you want to remove, the pour stub, which is big and chunky, whole. So instead, take a razor saw and you're going to hold it as close as you can to where the part separates from the pour stub. And then you're just going to... I forgot to mention one of the most important considerations when working with resin, and that's safety. Sanding and cutting resin generates a lot of resin dust, and that dust is at the very least an irritant, and at worst it can be quite harmful. So what you want to do is keep it out of your lungs and your eyes. To keep it out of your lungs, go to your hardware store and pick up a mask that's rated for particulates, such as a N95 mask that we've all become so familiar with here lately. So you want to grab one of those. The other thing you want is some eye protection. You can get safety glasses at most hardware stores too, again, to protect your eyes from anything that might be flying off or the resin dust that's being generated. Now, I've said to go ahead and wear those. I'm not going to for the purposes of this video so that you can clearly hear me, and we're not doing a lot of cutting and sanding. We're just going to do a little bit for the purposes of video. But if I was in the workshop, when I'm in the workshop working with resin, I'm always wearing a face mask and eye protection because I don't want to die. So you want to line the edge of the blade up with the edge of the part where it meets the pour stub, as close to the part as you can get. And then you're just going to gently saw. Now the resin is fairly soft, so it will go through it fairly quickly. You'll probably have to turn it around to get through the other side. And there you go. That is the pour stub separated. You can see there's a little bit left of it here, but just like with a plastic part, you're going to take a sanding stick and just and you just keep sanding until you're satisfied that it's flush with the bottom of the rest of the seat. You can even use a hobby knife if you need to scrape corners, just like you do with plastic. Just go gently so you don't cut into the part. And there, that seat is pretty much ready to go. There are a couple of little places here that need some clean out. There's some little thin pieces of resin here. So I'm just going to use the hobby knife to cut those out. Again, being careful not to break the part. So now we'll come in here with the sanding stick, and you want to be really careful here and just gently rub it back and forth. This resin is soft, that thin resin is soft, so it doesn't take a lot of work, but you don't want to bend, you don't want to go too hard or you risk breaking these fragile parts. And then once you're satisfied, you have a nice clean seat. Now, as we've talked about, resin can be very delicate. And in some cases, like this frame from the Spitfire, it is wafer thin. I mean, it's just a beautifully thin part. And Eduard's done a really nice job of casting it that way. But that also means it's very delicate to get out of there. So again, you're going to use the saw, but you want to make sure you brace the part. And this is one of those instances where I would be inclined to just push the blade through in one direction rather than trying to push and pull, so that I'm putting pressure in only one direction and risking less catching the part with the teeth of the blade. Okay, so you can see it's separated on that one side. Go ahead and do the other one. Okay. And then you can see it's hung up in a little bit of the flash there. So I'm just going to take the knife and run it through that flash to separate the part. And then while there's still a little bit of flash and so forth on here, that can be cleaned up basically the same way I cleaned up the flash on that seat, you know, hollowed out the areas that were there. The knife blade works, and then a little bit of sanding, and you should be good to go. One of the things about this too is I'd recommend going along the side of the part while you're sanding instead of across it. Again, just less chance of catching it and either bending it or breaking it. So we've prepped our resin parts. How do we attach them? Well, you can't use plastic solvent cement because it doesn't work on resin. So you're going to need to use either super glue or two-part epoxy. For small parts, super glue works just fine. In this case, I have this little brace for the floor of the Spitfire that goes into this floor piece. I'm going to go ahead and place it into the floor. Just make sure it's down and in place. It sort of clicks into place. And then I'm going to take some thin super glue and I'm just going to run it down into the joins. And then I'm just going to let that dry in place. Now you can use accelerator if you need to speed up those parts. In this case, I don't need to. I'm just going to let it do its thing. This is fairly fast setting thin glue. Flows around nicely. For larger parts, you might use a thicker setting like gel super glue that will take a little bit longer to dry, give you a little bit more adjustment time, and that will probably require you to use accelerator to make sure you get it set up once you've got it in place. For larger parts, you're going to want to use two-part epoxy. It just gives more strength, particularly when the parts are heavy and there's a lot of weight on them. So in this case, I have this figure of Phantom, and as I discovered after I bought him, he apparently had a bad run-in with somebody and got kneecapped. So his legs are broken at the knees, both of them. Good news is the break is fairly easy to line back up, so I can glue them, but because those are carrying quite a bit of weight, I want to pin them first. To do that, I'm going to use brass rod. So before I even start drilling, what I'm going to do is make sure that I have the holes lined up. I'm going to take some black paint. I'm going to put a dot here and here. Make sure I get enough on there. And then I'm going to hold the part in place hard enough that it should mark the other side. And then I'll do the same with this one. There we go. So now I'm going to actually put the pins into his upper legs. So I'm using a drill bit that's the same diameter as the 1mm brass rod that I'm using. So I'm just going to put this in the middle of the black dot, and I'm just going to drill. Now, because this is a fairly bad break and there's a lot of weight on this, I want these brass rods to go as deep as possible. So I'm just going to keep drilling. The good news is resin is actually pretty easy to drill. It just takes work. As you can see, there is dust being generated, so this is another instance where you're probably going to want to use a mask and eye protection. So then I'll go ahead and put this in the center of this dot, and it's the same thing. So I've got the holes in his upper legs ready. I'm just going to double check and make sure that the brass rod will fit in there before I get any further along. Yep, fits nicely. Yep, good. All right, so for his lower legs, I'm actually going to use a slightly bigger drill bit. What this does is it means that the hole that the brass from the upper leg is going into is a little bit bigger, gives me a little bit of play in case it's not perfectly aligned. So as I'm adjusting it, I can get it just right. I'm not locked into place by the rod being just slightly misaligned. So again, center in the black dot. The bigger bit works a lot faster. So I went ahead and checked the fit of the brass rod on his left leg, and it is fitting just perfectly. When I line it up, I get a good match up, so the holes are where they need to be. So how do you do that? Well, to begin with, take your brass rod, insert it all the way into the hole that it's going to go into, and then you can check the amount of brass rod you need to leave on there by putting the drill bit into the hole on the lower leg, and then just put your finger where the drill bit is, put it on, and then that'll give you the length that you need. Hold it up against the brass rod, and then clip the brass rod. And I always leave just a little bit more than I think I'm actually going to need, so I can trim it shorter. It's better to be too long than too short in this case. And then just clip it off. And then you can go ahead and test fit it. And as I expected, it's a little too long. So I'm going to go ahead and clip it shorter. And then test fit again. And in this case, it's not lined up very well at all. So I'm going to have to make some adjustments. So how do we go about that? Well, you can open up this hole a little bit wider by drilling it out next to the hole that you've already drilled in the direction it needs to move. And then you should be able to use the drill and just open up the bit between the two holes. In theory. Basically, I'm using the side of the bit here to grind that hole bigger between the two of them. Again, you're going to fill this with epoxy, so the size of the hole is less critical. As long as the pin goes into it and gets held by the epoxy, you're in good shape. All right, let's see how that works. Much better. I'm ready to attach the legs, so the first thing I'm going to do is dip one end of the brass rod into the epoxy that I've mixed, and then I will insert it into his leg, push it all the way in. Then I will take some more and we'll smear it around on the actual joining surfaces. And put a good blob onto the needle, because that's going up into that larger hole. And then we insert. And it's squeezing some out, but that's okay. I can sand that away when it dries. And it helps to fill the gap around the knee. Now this will take 5 minutes to set up. Mostly just make sure you've got it aligned before it does that. I'm just going to let him sit upside down so that his legs dry in place. In about 5 minutes, that should be, they're not going to move anymore. So it's been 5 minutes and the epoxy appears to have set. So his legs look like they're pretty secure now. So I'm going to go ahead and stand him up and get him looking at the camera there. You can see how attractive Phantom is. And so that's what pinning is about. The arms, I would probably go ahead and pin as well. They've got some fairly good divots in there where the glue could sit, the epoxy could sit. But that pinning is just going to give you some extra strength. And pinning's not just for figures. If you're building a resin airplane where their wings or butt joins into the fuselage, or even if they have just small locators, not atypical for resin kits, then you're going to want to pin those because those resin wings are probably solid and they're going to carry a lot of weight, and you don't want them hanging down and getting anhedral instead of dihedral where there should be dihedral. You can use the same techniques for pinning road wheels to axles, for pinning seats into interiors. It just gives you a little bit more strength if there's any question about the weight of the parts. So that about wraps up our video on dealing with tips and techniques for resin. Thanks for watching. I'm Aaron Skinner. We'll see you next time.